Hey everyone, this is Mrs. Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our notes on Unit 0, which is the first unit in our course and kind of serves as a little introduction to a lot of the practices and skills and common themes that are going to arise within our class throughout the school year. Now, what am I going to cover in this lecture? I'm going to talk a little bit about an introduction to what is environmental science, as well as two common themes that kind of appear in our course, known as tragedy of the commons, as well as sustainability. And lastly, I'm going to touch upon a couple of the required legislation that we are going to need to know in this course as well. So, looking at what is environmental science? Well, if you think about, the environment, what are some things that you might find in the environment? Most likely living organisms, For example, like in our biome, you might find populations of squirrels, deers, birds, But you're also going to find non-living components as well. Those non-living components can be things like the temperature, could be water, could be soil, and so on. And if we think back to bio, the terms that we use to refer to those things can be biotic, referring to living, while abiotic we know refers to non-living. So together those things make up an environment. Now, what about the human influence on the environment? Well, we know that the environment in which we live in can pretty much determine maybe how healthy we might be, how much we might grow, Because if our air quality is poor, if our water quality is poor, our health is most likely going to decline. We may not grow as easily. We know it can also determine how easily we may move around, If we have to go in and build roads, build buildings. It can also influence the food that we eat and how effectively we may grow that food if we look at our agricultural practices. And so our influence on the environment is what we will examine very closely in this class. Now, I mentioned on day one, not only will we talk about, obviously, biological ideas, but in environmental studies, we'll talk about chemistry, we'll talk a little bit about physics, we'll kind of get in there, some earth science, but there's also some economics, there's ethics, there's law involved in this course as well. So we will kind of touch upon all of those things as we move through content. Now, how do we determine, since we do have a great influence on the environment, how do we determine, how healthy an environment may be, or the current state of the environmental system? Well, there's a couple different factors or indicators. One would be looking at biodiversity. Biodiversity would be the variety of life that we have in an ecosystem. We can look at food production. How effectively are we growing our crops? How much crop yield do we have? The average global surface temperatures and CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Together, both of those can influence climate change. We can look at human population. The number of people that reside in a certain area is going to influence, what's happening in the environment. As well as resource depletion, So what resources are we consuming and using for our own use? So here in this table here, it gives us a little more detailed outline of those global indicators that I just mentioned and some of the trends that we are starting to see, In terms of biodiversity, we're seeing large numbers of extinctions of organisms, followed by greater CO2 concentrations, temperature increase, All of that can play a role with one another, especially in terms of climate change, Our food production per capita or per person production is possibly leveling off or so, and we can kind of see that human population has to do with that, We're still increasing in terms of human population, but our growth rate is slowing over time. And lastly, looking at resource depletion. Lots of the resources that we've now used for many, many, many years are quickly being depleted, and so we are going to, as a population, as humans, we are going to have to maybe develop some new resources, Research new ways to obtain things or maybe recycle things. Okay. Now, looking a little more closely at our resource depletion, what types of resources do we commonly use? That would be natural resources, especially ones that might provide energy and materials like fossil fuels. And now, extracting a lot of these resources can not only affect our health and the environment, but they can also influence some of those other indicators that I just mentioned too. And there's actually quite a pattern amongst the human population when it comes to resource consumption. So we tend to see, right, in the developed world, right, approximately about 17% of our world's population lives in a developed country. And it's actually those countries that use majority of the resources that we have. Now, as developing nations continue to grow economically and become more developed over time, we start to see them also using more and more resources. So this is an issue that we are going to have to certainly deal with now as well as in the future if we want to ensure that future populations have the same resources we do. Now, there is a phenomenon known as tragedy of the commons, and this is a phenomenon that kind of comes up quite often in our class, but this is a phenomenon proposed by an ecologist known as Garrett Hardin. He proposed that the overuse of a common resource, when someone uses that resource for their own self-interest or own short-term gain, is going to deplete whatever that common resource may be. So without any agreement or regulation of its use, it will eventually become overused and depleted. Now, in order to regulate something, that's usually going to have to be done by either maybe the users or maybe a governmental agency would have to step in. Now, what would be an example of a commons? Something that is publicly shared by people that has the potential to be overused or depleted. That could simply be public lands. It could be our air, right? Nobody necessarily owns, right, our air, as well as the water, oceans, right? Each of those are examples of commons, something that nobody particularly owns. It is a publicly shared resource that, as a result, can become overused or depleted. So here's just a quick little image of that, and this was kind of the example that Garrett Hardin proposed when he first identified the tragedy of the commons. Right here we see use of the commons is below the carrying capacity of the land, right? We only have about 3 sheep or so there, but if one or more users increase that use of commons, so now more and more farmers bring in more and more sheep to graze in that area, it goes beyond that area's carrying capacity, the commons becomes degraded. And the cost of the degradation is then accrued by all users, right? Now there's no real area for their sheep to graze. And unless environmental costs can be accounted for this and addressed and regulations be put in place, this land is going to eventually be unable to support any type of activity in the future. Now, here's a real-life example of the tragedy of the commons. In Newfoundland, the Atlantic cod fishery actually collapsed in the 1990s. So here we saw populations of commercially available fish, such as cod, which is a renewable resource as long as the cod are able to reproduce. But in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of those commercial fishing technologies tried to maximize the number of cod that they can catch. And as a result, they overfished that area, and by the 1990s, the population of cod was so low that the fishing industry wound up collapsing. And so this is where sustainable development kind of comes into play. Right? So can we continue our current level of resource consumption without necessarily jeopardizing the well-being of future generations? Well, we need to see environmental systems, right, not be damaged beyond their ability to recover. So we need to ensure that we don't happen to see tragedy of the commons. We need to maybe implement more renewable resources, ones that may not deplete as fast as they generate. For example, things like solar, wind, or hydroelectric power. Non-renewable resources like fossil fuels, right, need to be used more sparingly to ensure that we can have them for longer periods of time. So all in all, right, one of the more common themes amongst our class is the theme of sustainability, right? Living on Earth in a way that allows humans to use its resources without depriving future generations. This is a big, big common theme, especially when it comes to environmental solutions, right? What they're looking for you to do and what I'm looking for you to do is come up with solutions to ensure sustainability. So let's take a moment and practice a little bit about what we just went over. So here, take a moment and answer the first two questions. All right, we should have answered the multiple choice questions looking at number 1, which the following is an example of the tragedy of the commons. Remember, a commons is going to be a publicly shared resource that, due to someone's self-interest or self-gain, will overuse or deplete that resource. So here in question number 1, B would be your correct answer. Offshore clam beds in public areas are depleted below replenishment levels by overfishing. Looking at the next one, right, sustainable development. Remember, right, sustainability means ensuring that future generations are able to use those resources as well. So sustainable development, B would be our correct answer. It means consuming resources without compromising future availability. All right, and I'm going to leave our last slide of this video with our required legislation. You should have received a copy of this in class today. I would hold on to that sheet for the entire year because we are going to kind of go into each of these a little bit more in depth as we hit them in units, but I wanted to expose them to you now. So these are just some of the pieces of law that you need to be familiar with in our course, and you will see these appear on your Unit 0 quiz. So looking at the first, right, Clean Air Act, this was an act that just in general terms is used to try to reduce air pollution, specifically things like sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides. That's the SO2 and NO that you see there. CITES, or the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. This is a law that basically prohibits the trade of endangered species internationally. The Montreal Protocol was a key piece in healing our ozone layer and reducing what's known as chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. The Safe Drinking Water Act pertains to protecting drinking water, while the Clean Water Act pertains to the regulation of discharge of pollutants into waterways. Make sure you know the difference between the two. CERCLA, or Superfund, this is a law that is in response to the release of hazardous substances. So this law basically regulates when companies have to dispose of hazardous materials, how do they do that, and if they do happen to do it illegally, they will then be fined through this law. Kyoto Protocol pertains to lowering greenhouse gases, while the Endangered Species Act protects endangered species within the United States. The Delaney Clause prohibits the use in food of additives which have not been necessarily tested. And lastly, the RCRA, or Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also has to do with the management of hazardous waste, also non-hazardous waste, medical waste. It's pretty much how do much larger companies dispose of something, right? Where does that material come from? How is it being made? How is it being disposed of? So it has what's known as a cradle-to-grave system in how they analyze waste management. All right, everyone, if you have any questions, please leave that at the end of the video and summarize what you may have learned.